Welcome to the Mars panel. This is a panel looking at games around Mars and the reality of the exploration of Mars. I'm delighted to be joined by a panel of experts in game development and in the actual science and exploration of Mars. So I'd like to introduce, so I'm Tomas Rawlings from Auroch Digital, and I'm a developer on Mars Horizon. I'd like to introduce the panel. Sue, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Sue Horne. I'm Head of Space Exploration at the UK Space Agency. I look after all the exploration programmes. These are defined by regions where humans can work and live. So I look after our participation in the International Space Station, the lunar activity, and importantly, Mars.
Brilliant. And Sian, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I am Sian Proctor. I'm a geoscience professor in Phoenix, Arizona, and I'm also an analog astronaut. And that means that I like to live in Moon and Mars simulations and engage in human spaceflight research and training here on Earth. And so I've lived in multiple simulations, including the high seas habitat on the Big Island of Hawaii and the Mars Desert Research Station and Lunaris habitat in Poland.
Brilliant. And Mike, if you'd like to introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, my name is Mike Rausch, and I'm the co-founder of Choice Provisions Games. We made a game called Tharsis about a trip to Mars, and I believe that is why I'm here, and that's what I'm going to talk about.
It is indeed. And on that, I think, Sian, it'd be good if you could give us a kind of start in this. You know, you've kind of, done a lot of science communication as well as the actual science. Why do you think it is that people like myself and Mike and other developers are making games about Mars? Why are we still so fascinated by Mars?
Well, I think one of the big things is that humans have been fascinated by Mars ever since we've been able to, looking up at the night sky and just been captivated by it. Galileo was the first to look at Mars through a telescope during the 19th century. And then following that, you had the first published maps of Mars. And when people started looking at Mars through telescopes and publishing and really imagining what was happening on the surface of Mars, it just fueled our imagination. You had Giovanni Schiaparelli, who was an Italian astronomer, who came up with this map of Mars with canals or canale. And that led to a lot of speculation that Mars had been terraformed or engineered by Martians. And that, I think, really kind of like sets the notion in pop culture and sci-fi of what would it mean to have an alien civilization not so far away. And so thinking about H.G. Wells and the War of the Worlds and also other famous authors like Heinlein and Ray Bradbury with the Martian Chronicles. And as that sci-fi and our imagination gets fueled, the science comes along and we really kind of start to figure out, well, what really is happening. And, we've been able to send robotic probes to Mars. And I think one of the big things is that as we have probed Mars and learned more, us as a species feel like Mars is obtainable, like we can live there. There's enough similarities to the geology and the features that we see on Mars that remind us of features here on Earth, and that we can go there and successfully figure out how to make humans a multi-planet species through Mars.
Well, on that, you've done work sort of preparing people to go to Mars, that difficulty, because it's a challenge. I mean, how far? That's a long way, isn't it? I'm wondering how far it is, and what kind of work? Could you describe a little bit of some of the work you've done in helping prepare humanity to be there and get there?
Yeah, sure. One of the cool things is that the space agencies around the world, whether that's NASA or the UK Space Agency, ESA, Jackson stuff, we're looking at long duration space flight, and what does that mean for human exploration? And the thing about that is that begins here on Earth. We don't want to send people far away, especially to Mars, and not have them ready and equipped and prepared for all of the challenges that are going to happen, not only along the way, but also when we get onto the surface of the Earth. And so there are these analog sites. An analog site is a site that is similar to something else. And so around the world, there are these analog sites that allow us to feel like we're on a Martian surface or a Martian environment. And one of those locations happens to be the Big Island of Hawaii. And this is the high seas habitat at night. And it sits on the slopes of Mauna Loa, the Big Island, at about 8,000 feet. And it is a Mars simulation. And so I happen to be fortunate to be able to live in this habitat for 4 months as part of the very first crew. And it was specifically funded by NASA to investigate food strategies for long duration spaceflight. So when we think about Mars and going and surviving, not only surviving, but thriving on Mars, one of the things that food is a big one, right? And we've got Mike here to talk about food. And why food is so important. But there's so many things like food, crew cohesion, how do you deal with the stresses, communication, along with the technical things of just air, water, shelter, radiation exposure, all of these other things that are kind of technical.
Brilliant, thank you. And Sue, it would be really interesting to know, some of the work that you and your colleagues have been involved with in terms of Mars. Like, where there's the ExoMars mission going up. We've had Mars Express. Could you give us a run through of a couple of the things that have happened recently, and also have been happening?
Okay, so in 2016. We launched the first element of ExoMars. This is an orbiter that goes right around Mars, and it's looking at the atmosphere. At the moment, it's concentrating on science and looking at the atmosphere. When the second stage goes, it will turn into a data relay satellite. So the second stage is where the UK is playing an important role, is to build a rover. The ExoMars rover is now being called Rosalind Franklin because Rosalind Franklin was one of the early women to work on DNA. So this is in recognition of her work. And the rover has been built by Airbus in Stevenage near London. And this rover its unique features compared to the other rovers that are going to Mars is it can drill 6 feet underground, so it can get below where the radiation penetrates and get to that clean samples that have been unaltered. So what we're trying to do is look at the past environment of Mars, how it has evolved, when and where the conditions occurred that could have supported life. And importantly, it's got instrumentation that can look at the organics that it may find and identify whether those organics are from life. So it could detect past, or at the best, really best, if we look at current life on Mars.
So what do you think the chances of that are? I mean, what do you think there's a good chance? Yeah, I mean, speculation, I get, but what do you think?
I think current life on Mars I think not. We would be extremely lucky. But 4 billion years ago, there was water on Mars. It was very Earth-like. And 4 billion years ago was when life started on Earth. So that emerging life, we could find in a sort of fossil record. We've got. So we're going to an area which had water. We know had water. We've looked at the orbital photographs, so we know that there has been past water there. So we've got a good chance.
That's exciting. Well, we've been joined by our another guest who's turned up, which is fantastic. Jacob, I wonder if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself to everybody here, just who you are and what great game you work on.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
We can indeed.
Okay, nice to see you again.
Yes.
Those of you I see again, and nice to see you others as well. I'm Jacob Fryxelius. I'm a game designer, and I designed the game Terraforming Mars, which is about terraforming Mars, making it Earth-like, and recreating those conditions you talked about a little, to some extent at least. And well, it's a board game, and as a scientific background, I have a PhD in chemistry, and I teach science, natural sciences, and I have used this background of mine to paint maybe plausible, but at least possible future scenario that players can play through using many different ideas from both NASA, ESA, science fiction, and some ideas that just would come naturally. That's maybe not so spectacular to have grass on Mars, for example, but that's one of the things you can do.
Well, just on that topic, just to dig into a little bit more, would you be able to describe for people who've not played either, because there's a digital version as well, either the physical or the digital one? I played both and they're great. Would you be able to describe for people a little bit about what the game loop is? What does the player get to do? How does it kind of work?
Yeah, so each player plays a corporation. So our future vision is that corporations will drive the colonization and terraforming, but backed by governments, more or less. So they compete in an official arena, so to speak. And what you do is you play cards, and those cards represent different projects that you can do, and that can increase your production of different resources. You have steel, titanium, you have money, you have plants and energy, and you also have heat, because on Mars, global warming is a good thing. So you can have a lot of different things that utilizes these and enhances these. And as you do this, you step by step terraform the planet Mars. And when it's terraformed, the game ends, and you see how well you did. And the corporation who did the best will win the game. So that's very short.
Oh, that's a great.
It's difficult to describe more without a picture and so on, and demo.
Well, there's links to all the game below that people can check out. But just as a quick aside on that, when you see, like Jeff Bezos with Blue Origin and the kind of like, the money they're putting into space exploration, and obviously, taking a lot of headlines is Elon Musk with SpaceX. Do you start to think, oh, well, the kind of future I created in my fiction is starting to come to pass? Yeah,
for sure. Now they started these industries before we made the game, so it was already, the idea was already there. But I think for us it made sense as well that corporate interests, which are driven by profits, will be more constant and more reliable in the long run than governments, which can, a new government can come in and say, we're not interested in this anymore. And maybe they have a war and have to divert all their resources to another end, and so on. So in the long run, our vision is that the corporations will likely be the more reliable in these scenarios, but as I said, backed by governments for most part. And by the way, Sian, nice to see you again. And I see you have the game Terraforming Mars in your background as well. So if the viewers would like to know what it looks like, it's the boxes over there. Thank you.
Well, on that, Sian, you're a scientist who's looked at this. What are some of the practicalities to actually terraforming Mars? I mean, how big an undertaking are we talking? I mean, the game covers it, but yeah, how big a deal?
It's a very big deal. We are talking. Some people suggest I would make a game called Terraforming Earth to get us out of global warming. And then we're talking about a degree or two or something like that. Here we're talking about raising the degrees like 40, 50 degrees Celsius or Kelvin, whatever you would like to measure it in. It's a big, huge deal. You have to create a whole new atmosphere. You have to somehow get oceans to Mars and other things as well. So it's a huge undertaking, but this game takes place in 400 years from now, and we have to expect some scientific progress, some technological progress. And one of the main thing there, I think, will be robotics. If we can, if we can make robots that can make more robots, and utilize the energy from the sun and maybe other sources, and utilize materials from Mars itself or from asteroids to make more robots, then we can multiply the work. And there's a old Chinese or Japanese riddle that you had an emperor who wanted one rice on the checkerboard, on the chessboard, and on the next one he wanted the double amount. So that's two corns of rice. Pieces of rice, and then the next one 4, and then 8, and then 16, and so on, and it multiplied to be more than the kingdom had. I try to remember, but
no, I've heard that.
It gets really out of hand. You cannot really see how much it will be. So there is a possibility. But we will have to see.
I mean, Dr. Proctor, you're a geologist, so you're used to working at big timescales. Much bigger than human life. What are your thoughts on the practicalities of terraforming Mars?
Well, again, like Jacob was saying, it would indeed be the biggest endeavor humanity could take on, terraforming a planet and making it habitable. And technology is going to be the key to that. I think that advances in technology, the more we know by going to the moon, our ability, as stated, when it comes to looking at mineral resources within our solar system, robotics is a huge component on that. And to some extent, AI and the ability to replicate and to do a lot of the work that we just can't do now with the manpower and stuff, human power, I should say, to be able to go and do that type of activity. But if you look at the rovers that we're sending, and I know Sue can talk about this, and the technology and the sensors and the capabilities, it's getting more and more sophisticated. And so you look at, well, what does that mean in terms of human habitation? I think that it's definitely the direction we're going in, but we'll learn a lot along the way through the analogs that we do here and our experiences on the moon and how successful we are there. That really does open up the roadmap to Mars.
Well, Sue, it'd be good to bring you in here. You're doing the thinking now and the planning around the first step of that, getting somebody there. When somebody says, "Hey, let's terraform it," what sort of runs through your head?
I think that's a long way in the future. I think we'll be adapting to learn how to live in this environment and be able to live in the Martian environment before going to terraforming. But if you look at history and you think in less than 100 years, we went from not being able to fly to landing someone on the moon. So 400 or 500 years from now, potentially it's possible.
And what kind of practical stuff are you working on through the UKSA and through ESA in terms of getting people to Mars at the moment? What kind of projects have they got ongoing?
Well, we're at the very early stages at the moment. We're trying to understand the environment on Mars so we can understand the hazards and what resources maybe are on Mars that we can utilize, because you don't want to take you can't take everything with you. We're going to have to use the resources on Mars. So we extract oxygen from water and things like that. That's one of the things we're working on in situ resource utilization. Also looking at a small nuclear reactor, modular reactors in space to provide energy. One of the really big problems is keeping your astronauts safe. And I think that is going to be the really difficult one to sort out. Radiation environment on the way to Mars and when you're at Mars. to find ways to protect astronauts. So there's looking at, do you have somewhere in the spacecraft that is heavily shielded? Other work has been looking on, can you make a mini magnetosphere? So there's a magnetosphere around the Earth that protects us from this radiation. So can you do a mini one around a spacecraft? And I've also heard people who are actually looking at hibernation. They found out that hibernating animals suffer less from radiation. So it sounds a bit far-fetched, but could you actually put astronauts in the deep sleep, and would that help? So there's some quite speculative work, and then some really hard front-edge technology on the in-situ resource utilization. The AI, we're going to have AI. And just the problem of communication is for the astronauts, and the psychology. There's been lots of work about the psychology of astronauts. It's a 500-day trip to Mars and back. And how do you cope with that? So there have been isolation studies that have lasted 500 days to see what happens.
Well, we're going to come back to that with Tharsis as well, as kind of one of the themes that comes on. Jacob, just as a slight aside, the game is digital and physical, as this event celebrates games that operate in both spaces. Do you know if the players of Terraforming Mars are they kind of two separate camps? Those who play digital, those who play physical, or are they both united just by a common interest in Mars, or are they basically the same group?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both, but I don't really have an overview of the digital players so much, but I do follow Board Game Geek, where the physical board game players are usually active, and I can say that for sure there are a lot of board gamers who also play the digital version. So there is a significant overlap, but I'm not at all sure if it's significant from the digital version point of view. So to speak.
On that topic as well, how much do you think that the players of the game, because the game's done really well, I mean, it's a great game, but if you'd have made exactly the same gameplay loop, but you hadn't have had the idea of terraforming Mars at the core of it, do you think it would have been as successful as it has been and would have captured as much imagination as it has? Do you think that's a key part of it?
It's one of the key parts of it. So I guess, there were a lot of factors that worked together for us. But I do think that the theme is, it's a key part. We knew we had a unique and new theme for the game. So we were really afraid that someone else would come, and there were a lot of Mars games coming the same year. So we were very nervous about not getting to be the big Mars game, but lucky for us, we were. But definitely the Mars theme helped a lot, and I think the uniqueness of terraforming has also worked to our advantage. And also, I would say the scientific angle of it, to have plausible things happen, and also, so as I said, a lot of factors. So the epic scale, and a lot of things.
And just to involve the others, if they want to chime in on this, because I feel that once you've got games that have, especially if they've got a kind of scientific theme to it, that in my experience it draws people into becoming interested in science and technology, and it's a kind of way, like, we can't all be astronauts, we can't all necessarily be scientists, but by playing a game we can at least reflect our interest in that. I mean, Sian, you've done a lot of science communication. How important is kind of pop culture things like games at drawing people into these topics?
Well, games and science fiction are usually your first avenue into this. As a kid, I remember that how important it was and fun it was to play games in my house, and then, but also reading and learning about science fiction and spurring the imagination, right? what ifs. And I think games do that in a fun, family-oriented way, where you can sit around a table, you can have a really cool board game like this, and you can engage in a discussion on the possibilities of this happening and the technology. And that's what's, to me, could we really do this? Well, what would we need? And so for me, watching Star Trek as a kid and just being like, okay, I want, the camcorder. And then I remember getting my first flip cell phone and being like, Scotty, beam me up. I mean, didn't we all kind of play that kind of a little bit, flipping it and just pretending that? But here was the technology that allowed us to communicate in a way that had been illustrated through pop culture. And I think that that's what's so great about it, is that one feeds into the other so nicely.
Mike, we'll come back to you in Tharsis in a minute, but I'm interested, what got you into Mars? Was it just was there a certain film or book or game that led you to say, yeah, I really want to make something with Mars as part of it?
I think Star Trek actually is like one of the big motivating factors in my life. My son's middle name is actually Tiberius, which is Captain Kirk's middle name as well. Obviously, pop culture got me interested in Mars, but growing up, my dad always had telescopes. He would always teach me about our solar system and constellations and everything. Some of the lore of Mars that we've heard of, when I was a kid, it's like, oh, there are pyramids on Mars, and obviously we know the facts there, but still, that's that kind of stuff that gets your mind sort of focused on a planet like Mars. Also, when you look up in the sky, it's so red, especially this week. It's a beautiful week to look at Mars. So it's sort of those factors. Mars, this big red, sort of interesting, location of what possibility could be in the solar system, and like the Scapo Valley maps. We once thought there were canals and conceptually life there. So I don't know. I think the pop culture has planted the fascination within me for my whole life.
And Sue, you nodded when both Mike and Sian were talking Star Trek. Have you got a resonance there as well?
Oh yes, I was brought up on Star Trek and Doctor Who.
Yes.
So I think that was a big influence. Books and science fiction. I remember as a child, reading Isaac Asimov and the Space Ranger books, and I think also I was brought up in the era of the Voyager spacecraft, and I can remember I used to go to my grandmother's for lunch. I used to dash to hers to see the latest images coming back of the real planet. That was brilliant. And another inspirational person was James Burke, and he just interested in science and just question why is it like that. And I think that's the thing, to get people questioning and thinking. And what I'm always really pleased, if I think of a question and then I can logically go through and work out the answer. I think that's the great thing about games. It helps you develop that, I hope, that logical approach to some of the problems.
What was really interesting when we got very kindly invited, because we connected with the UK Space Agency at first, and then your colleagues in turn connected us with the European Space Agency, which obviously you're a member of. And I went to visit a couple of the sites on the UK on ESA sites in Europe, obviously pre-COVID, and to me there was this sense of Star Trekkiness about it. There was all these people from all these different nations, and they'd all come together to try and advance our knowledge and understanding of space, and it was really exciting, chatting with all these people, and I kind of felt that Star Trekkiness, which and obviously we it's a good segue into our game. So we're making a game, Mars Horizon, and in Mars Horizon slightly differently to say Tharsis and Terraforming Mars. The timeline is a little bit further back, closer to where we are now. But the aim of the game is to run a space agency in order to complete the first crewed mission to Mars. You want to get people there and back. And so for us, we started, we started the gameplay loop actually at the beginning of the dawn of the space race. So right at the start when people were launching rockets, and the idea is that everything within the game has some basis within science and technology. So it's either a vehicle that was planned or something that maybe was created but never launched. So for example, we've got the Soviet Buran, the Soviet space shuttles, which are fantastic looking vehicles in the game. So it could be that the first person in space was a member of the European Space Agency, or the first satellite in space came from NASA, or it could be the first moon landing is completed by the Russian Space Agency, or make your own. But what's interesting is in the game flow that we've got now, is that you can get people to Mars if everything goes really well and you're pouring all your resource into it and nothing goes wrong. And of course, space exploration, things don't always go as planned, far from it. You could get to Mars maybe as early as 2030. I mean, is that a really unrealistic timeline, Sue? Are we pushing that too hard?
I think that's possibly pushing it a bit hard. Certainly by 2050. Well, it depends how much money you put in it. That's the basic thing. If you threw the amounts of money at the problem at the same pace that America originally did with the first moon landings, I think it's possibly feasible. I think 2050 is a more realistic date.
Okay. Well, on that, I noticed the European Space Agency recently did some announcements about exploration of the moon, and in our game, you can use the moon can be a helpful staging post in terms of getting to Mars. Are you able to kind of tell us a little bit more about what the thinking on the moon is currently?
Well, it's interesting scientifically, but also it's very expensive to go to Mars. But we need to develop and test technologies before we go to Mars, before we send humans to Mars. So the moon is a logical place to use. It's the nearest body, so we can use that to test some of our technologies before getting them absolutely right before risking going to Mars.
And what do you see as the biggest challenges in terms of your work of getting people there and back? What are the big technological barriers that we've got to yet overcome?
I think I personally think it's the radiation effects on humans. At the moment, we could get to Mars, but the health of the astronauts would be severely compromised.
I remember, I was involved in a project looking at games into space from a few years ago. We worked with the Wellcome Trust and a few other people on that. One of the suggestions that was thrown around, I think by one of the scientists involved, was that we're all spending this time like trying to create an environment that adapts to us. Maybe what we need to do is start adapting us to the environments. They were floating this idea, maybe we need to start genetically modifying human beings so that actually maybe we can take more radiation, maybe we use less oxygen. I don't know if you've come across these suggestions, anyone?
No, but we've had volunteers, people who have been quite willing to go do a one-way trip to Mars and die on Mars.
A one-way trip?
A one-way trip, yes.
So the other thing that I think makes when we are not in our game in the kind of loop is the amount of things that can go wrong in the process. And as the game progresses and you start stacking together more and more things, that have got to go right. That's the other thing that strikes me about a mission to Mars is there's the longer the mission goes on, the more likelihood there is something's not going to work. Is that it's a very basic summary of it. How does that feature into your thinking?
I'm amazed at how reliable the spacecraft are and how the engineers design them. I worked on a mission called Cluster, which was supposed to finish in 2006, and it's still flying. Because they're expensive missions, you don't want to fail. You actually over-engineer them. So I think after the sort of first 1 or 2 flights, where you may have teething problems, I think it's very solid. You really concentrate. The engineers did so many tests on the models leading up to the final flight models that you've wrinkled out. You found and sorted out a lot of the problems. I think, well, not surprisingly, quite often the problems that we have been software problems, and it's very complicated to go through the software and test every possibility. So on the ExoMars orbiter, we had a demonstration lander, and that failed. There were several things wrong, but a key one was an issue on the software that just hadn't been modelled and worked through to make sure that the software worked.
How frustrating was that at that point, having got something all the way to Mars and then it doesn't work?
You learn to, you know, the risks when you set out down the road. It's disappointing, but you pick yourself up and start again. The cluster mission I mentioned earlier, the first one, it was launched on Ariane 501, and that rocket exploded on launch. And that was something like 10 years down. But the scientists, we built it again in I think it was in about 3 years. They managed to rebuild the 4 spacecraft.
I should say we do a podcast, and we've got a couple of podcasts with your colleagues talking about other aspects of the thing, which we obviously don't have time to cover here today. So your colleague Alice Bunn talking about the international director talking about the kind of diplomacy between space agencies, and also Paul Smith, the robotic exploration manager, talking about that, so people can check those out. And jump onto Tharsis now, and the best person to introduce the game and tell us a bit about what it's about is obviously here with us. So Mike, can you tell us about Tharsis and what it's about?
Yeah, so Tharsis, ultimately it's a game about overcoming these overwhelming situations and thinking, using your best critical thinking to get through a seemingly insurmountable situation. So the difference with Tharsis, in some ways, and I hate talking to people in the astronauts and this kind of thing about Tharsis, because one of our resources is actually the other astronauts and cannibalism. And as morose as that is, it's probably something that you don't really want to talk about. But Tharsis was based on the whaling ship Essex, and for those of you who may not know about it, it's basically what Moby Dick was based off of. A whale sinks a ship, and then it's the act of survival that comes after that, and essentially doing what it takes to survive. Now, when I play Tharsis, by the way, I never use cannibalism to get to Mars. My choice is always, I would rather fail than go there, but it's an interesting resource to introduce to the player. Yeah, so we also add an anomaly on Mars to get some sci-fi elements out of it, which is a temporal paradox, and there's some light warnings from the past or the future, depending on how you look at it. We also use a dice mechanic in Tharsis, and the interesting thing there is it introduces random numbers So in this case, it's these random events are happening, and you have random numbers and resources to figure out the event. But as random as it is, there's always a way out. And we don't know for sure, but we suspect that every game of Tharsis is winnable. When we launched it, a player played, I think, 40 games in a row and never lost one of them, just because he's such a critical thinker. So this is sort of the thing that's fascinating for me is, can you work your way out of any situation with the right resources? And I don't know the answer, but I do know that it's something that fascinates me.
And why did you pick Mars as the subject, the kind of the point that the story's driving towards, for want of a better term?
Well, Mercury and Venus, as we might all know, are a little warm in contrast to Mars. Mars is a little cooler, but you know, I think it's sort of what I mentioned earlier. There is the lore with Mars. There's the human fascination. I guess in some ways it's a sister planet to Earth. So that there's that element. There's water there. Humans like water quite a bit. You can, like Sue said, you can get oxygen from water. It's within reach. At least in our time setting that we have Tharsis in, it would be the closest place where we would want to go. One of the driving factors of our game is that there was a message coming from Mars that we wanted to investigate. And as much as I want to go to Mars, the question always arises for me is, well, what will eventually be there for us when we get there? And I know that exploration is what we do as a species. But you know, one of my driving factors for this was the sci-fi element, but I had a harder time trying to figure out a reason to go to Mars for a group of people for at least in the game setting.
And what I think, Sian, bringing you in here, because in Tharsis, like, you know, and correct me if I've got any of this wrong, Mike, from, you know, my playthrough it, the psychology of it seems to come across really well. The kind of stress of the enclosure and the space and the situation and the things going wrong. I mean, you've been in that situation with, you know, as an analog astronaut where you're in close proximity. I mean, what's that actually like?
Well, crew cohesion is something that is very critical. There's a lot of research doing around the world, and how do you pick a crew that can make this journey to Mars and not want to kill each other along the way, just out of stress related. One of the interesting things is we don't know what it's going to be like for the first humans to go that far and to look back at the Earth and realize that they are so far away from home. And the psychological stresses, you know, you go to the moon, you're talking 3 days, but Mars, it's months and months and months. And so it's a lot, it's you and the people you are with. And so when it comes to crew selection, the psychology, what does it take to be able to handle that? And then little things like, what do you need to help with that? What type of food will make you feel like, what do we take culturally with us that helps us stay connected and yet grounded from a psychological and emotional standpoint on the journey to Mars? And even when we begin to habitat and settle Mars, what does that, the psychology behind that? And so those are things that we can look at now. Luckily, I'm fascinated with Tharsis and the food because I did a cookbook called Meals for Mars.
Oh, man.
And so thinking about, you know, NASA funded this 4-month study on food strategies for long duration spaceflight. And as a pilot, one of the movies that I've always been fascinated with, or storylines, was Alive. I don't know if you are familiar with it, but a plane crashed in the Andes where, in order to survive, they had to engage in cannibalism, and what it means, what does survival mean when in terms of food. And so I've had a lot of experiences doing extreme things. And I was on a show called The Colony, which was an apocalyptic show where we ate really interesting things. But it really got me thinking about, like, where's my threshold of food, and what you're willing to eat is definitely dependent on how hungry you are. And a lot of times we think of, well, I would never do that. I would never go there. But under certain circumstances, we just don't know. And so how do we put people in circumstances like that, but not to the point where they make those kinds of decisions? And then how do we get strategies to mitigate that? Because that's really what it is about. It's about, there is going to be, crew conflict, and there is going to be issues that come up, but how we can best learn to mitigate those issues before we go helps with our ultimate ability to be successful.
I actually have a quick thing there, because I always wonder the psychology of food. When it's dinner time or we go to a restaurant, everybody's happy. It's hard to argue with food. So it's like, how much does food play a factor in the psychology of astronauts on a long-term mission? And you can see even in some of the Apollo footage, they'll pull out like a hot dog and they're eating cold hot dogs, which is terrible, but you can still see that the crew has smiles on their face when it's time to eat food. So that your cookbook is something that's interesting to me. I want to check that out.
Well, the psychology of food is really important. It's one of the basic things that we need to survive, but also the culture that we've developed around that. You don't need a dinner table necessarily on the ISS, but they have one, and they come together for a meal. It's where we exchange information, and we let our guard down, and we have stories. And yet what we put in, what we grow up eating, really has an impact on what we call comfort food. So you can think of what we're in now with COVID, and what kind of foods you've been eating, what have you been craving. When you get stressed out, what do you want? And if you're going to Mars and you get stressed out, and you don't have that Mars bar to munch on, and that's your favorite candy bar, how do you deal with that? Because you can really get fixated about food. And that's one of the things that I think a lot of us don't realize unless you've really been hungry. And what does that mean from a psychological standpoint when you're really hungry and you're stressed out and you don't have food to eat, and what impact that has on your decision making? Because when you're not nourished properly, but not just properly nourished, but satisfied, like your mind, your sensory perceptions are satisfied. And we know what that means. We've had meals where we're like, oh man, I chose poorly at a restaurant. Why didn't I get what that person over there has? And you're just not satisfied. And versus when you are, and you're happy and you're feeling good, and your ability to cognitively to function really well. And so that's why there's money going in, and why NASA's like, yeah, we'll pay for people to live in a habitat for 4 months or a year just to look at food.
What are the UK Space Agency doing regarding food? Now we're on food, and I'm getting hungry as we talk about this. What projects are going on at the UK Space Agency in terms of feeding people for missions?
Well, we haven't got any in the UK, but food is really important within the European Space Agency. They put a lot of effort in getting interesting food to the astronauts. They're always keen on the fresh fruit when they go up. Each astronaut, they have designed before they fly special meals, so that every week, every couple of weeks, so they can have a special meal. So it is a really important feature to keep the astronauts happy and maintain them. I think one of the lovely stories I have is where when one of the astronauts went up, he took some chocolates up to be made, and inside each chocolate was a special message from the partners of the astronauts that were up there. So it was a really nice touch.
I have a quick thing to say. Every time I talk about cannibalism in Tharsis, it always leads to people talking about food in general. But I actually have a quick question. When researching Tharsis, one of the things that came up talking about protecting astronauts from radiation was actually using the waste of astronauts and packing it in packages and then putting it inside the panels of the spacecraft to block radiation. Is this something that's true, or is this just some weird stuff I read online?
I've not heard about that one. Within the European Space Agency, we're actually looking at recycling using waste to have a full recycling system to grow food and use waste to grow food. So I haven't actually heard of it being used as a blocking for radiation. That is a new one on me.
Well, it's a good sort of segue to jump into, in general, what games are getting right and wrong. You know, where are us as kind of fictional creators getting things right? Jacob, to bring you back into the discussion on your area of science, because you as you discussed, kind of you got a big grounding in science and things like that. So how much of the work did you do in advance of terraforming Mars to actually figure out what's real and what's not, what would work as a game and what wouldn't?
Well, it was, I mean, I had a lot of these natural sciences, several different sciences already. So it was, for me, it was more of just piecing together. And I always really enjoyed science fiction that was more of the hard science fiction, that is more to the scientific side and not so much aliens and so on. So for me, the creation of the game fell very naturally. So I hope I get, I mean, it's 400 years into the future, so I get some leeway in what we get right, because I don't speculate that everything will be in the future, but some things I think will be for sure, and some things will be more likely than others. But the thing is, for us was to make it plausible, and I think we managed that. Of course, I researched some things as well, but I think also that for getting things right, it's not only scientifically right. I think it's getting the theme right, and presenting the theme in a very in a good and inspiring way. And I hope we succeeded with that. I recently played this Mars Horizon demo, and I liked it, and especially that you really feel like a space agency when you play it. So you get you get that very, very well, that thematic feeling, which I think is very important in a game for
Well, thank you, Jacob. That means a lot to me, coming from somebody who's designed such a great game as yourself. So that's very kind of you. I wonder if any other on the panel have got some thoughts on what games are doing right and doing wrong, or other media, you know, books, films, in terms of showing to the public through popular culture what the exploration, the getting to Mars, the being on Mars would be like.
I've got a quick one. I think just the fact that they're being made is important. Like, you know, like we said earlier, most of us grew up on this pop culture, you know, depictions of science and traveling out throughout the universe. And so I just think continuing that for the future generations and getting young people excited is really what games are doing right here.
I would agree with that. And I think, you know, movie-wise and book-wise, The Martian, thinking and your ability to actually be on Mars and some of the resources and stuff, and what really worked in that. And I think, talking about Jacob in the future, and when we're talking about terraforming Mars, again, having that, what I like about that game is that it gives you a wide options of ways to do it. And I think that it's one of those things where as the technology develops, and the kids who are playing this game now are the ones who are going to be thinking about, well, how do I make that possible with the future resources? So you take somebody who might be 10 now and loves this game, and then you make them, you put them 40 years in the future with all of the technological advances, and what that base will do for inspiring them. We just don't know. But all of us were inspired by Star Trek or Isaac Asimov, and the Foundation series is finally being made. We're like, what? And just things like that, and even The Expanse and the future of what that looks like. And so these are the things that help us imagine the possibilities of tomorrow through the technology that we have today.
Well, we're starting to run out of time, but I've got a chance for a couple more missions. That's good slip. Before we finish up, and I was wondering, so Sue, you had said previously that you thought maybe 2050 might be the first time we get a human to Mars. I wonder if anybody else has got any thoughts on, when do you think we're going to get people to Mars?
There's two ways of thinking about that. There's getting to Mars, and then there's boots on the ground on Mars, because there's a good chance that we can send somebody and just orbit and then come back. I think 2035 is my estimate, but again, I think it all goes on how well the moon goes. If the moon goes well, then with the timeline is quicker. If the moon goes poorly, then that typically pushes us back. And even with people like Elon Musk and stuff, who are really kind of pushing the narrative of going to Mars, landing on Mars, getting off Mars, and coming back, those are all different steps. And so there's a lot of complexity there. And so it'll be interesting to see.
So to push it out a bit further, then, where in Terraforming Mars you've got people settling on Mars, Sue, what's your estimate for when we might see a base on Mars, like first stage of that?
Ooh, that's a difficult one. And I think you might have to add, my 2050 is to have boots on Mars and not used to be orbiting. And I have a suspicion that you could be talking 50 years after that. It's a real guess, and I think we've actually got to ask the question: is it worthwhile having a base on Mars, and what are we going to do with it? What are we going to achieve with it? So I think there's some fundamental questions to ask before you make that sort of investment.
I think,
I'm sorry,
if I can address the question, I would think it was, I would be more in Sian's line, I think, because I think Elon Musk will beat NASA to Mars. Because there is exactly the question that Sue had, that what is it for? I mean, it can be 50 more and we have to be certain and so on. But if you leave it out of government hands, people can go because they are enthusiastic and they are willing to risk a lot more than the governments are willing to risk. And I think that will, if they have enough time, enough resources, and if Elon doesn't switch his interest to some other thing too much, I think he has a good chance. But as Sian said, we will have to see, because the future is not set yet.
Brilliant. And that is a perfect point to end it on. Thank you so much for taking part in this. Your insights have been utterly fascinating, and it's been a real joy to share a panel with you all. So thank you all for being with us, and appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.